May 3, 1945, Northern Germany. Just 4 days before the Third Reich finally collapses, the morning light hangs low over a ruined market square, filtered through smoke drifting from the night's fires. Buildings stand as hollow shells, their walls charred, windows shattered, roofs torn open by weeks of artillery. The war is almost over, but the silence feels uneasy, the kind that settles only when both armies are exhausted. A small American patrol advances slowly through the debris-strewn streets. Rifles lowered but ready. The men move past burned-out carts, collapsed beams, and discarded German uniforms. They have seen this scene 100 times since crossing the Rhine. Towns emptied of civilians. Surrendering soldiers wandering aimlessly. The smell of starvation blending with dust. Near the corner of a collapsed stone archway, one soldier stops. Something is lying half-buried under loose bricks and ash. At first he thinks it's another corpse, one more victim of the last chaotic retreat. But then he sees a faint movement, the slow rise of a chest. The trembling of a hand. He steps closer, brushing aside debris until he uncovers the faded blue-gray sleeve of a Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. And beneath it, the face of a young woman. Hollow-cheeked, eyes partly open, a body reduced by hunger to little more than bone and skin. She is still alive. And in that moment, the soldier realizes he has found not an enemy, but someone who will die within hours unless he intervenes. By the spring of 1945, Germany was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation collapsing under the weight of total defeat. The military front no longer existed as a continuous line. Instead, scattered pockets of resistance clung to villages, crossroads, or small clusters of woodland, fighting more out of habit than strategy. Commanders who once issued crisp orders now struggled to assemble units that even resembled armies. Communications failed. Supply routes disintegrated. And with each passing day, the American advance pressed deeper into the heart of a crumbling Reich. The Allied push across the Rhine in March had broken the last meaningful barrier protecting northern and central Germany. When U.S. forces surged eastward, they did so with a momentum that overwhelmed everything in their path. Armored columns rolled along highways littered with wreckage. Infantry divisions marched through towns where the population had either fled or starved. Every step forward tightened the noose around a regime already internally fractured. The Luftwaffe, once a feared air force, had almost ceased to exist. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining aircraft. Anti-aircraft units, staffed increasingly by teenage boys and female auxiliaries, were reduced to firing sporadically at Allied planes they couldn't hope to deter. These auxiliaries, Flakhelferin, performed critical support roles, range-finding, communications, plotting trajectories, relaying orders. Many were barely adults. When the air raid sirens stopped and the front lines shifted, they were often ordered to retreat on foot, carrying only the essentials they could hold. But the collapse was faster than their retreat. By late April and early May, tens of thousands of German soldiers flooded westward, trying desperately to surrender to the Americans rather than fall into Soviet hands. Columns of men marched with their hands raised before they even saw Allied troops. Others discarded their weapons and mingled with refugees, hoping anonymity would spare them. Amid this human tide, non-combat personnel, drivers, clerks, medics, and female auxiliaries were simply swept along by the confusion. Civilians suffered in equal measure. Allied bombing had destroyed transportation networks. Railroads lay twisted across cratered earth. Food distribution ended in some regions entirely. Cities starved first. Now rural towns followed. Black bread, already stretched with fillers, vanished from ration shops. Water pumps failed. Typhus spread through overcrowded basements where families sheltered from constant air raids. In northern Germany, where our story unfolds, the pressure was especially intense. The British and Canadians pushed from the northwest. The Americans advanced from the west and southwest. What remained of German command structures in the region fractured into isolated pockets. Orders to retreat, regroup, surrender, or resist often arrived too late or contradicted each other. Many units simply dissolved. In this chaos, female Luftwaffe personnel were often left behind. When batteries relocated, they sometimes took only essential equipment, leaving support staff to fend for themselves. Some auxiliaries attempted to follow retreating columns, but hunger, exhaustion, and the rapid Allied advance cut them off. Others, caught between converging forces, found themselves stranded in bombed-out towns where German control had evaporated overnight. As American forces moved deeper, they encountered these remnants constantly. Not soldiers in formation, but clusters of dazed individuals, sometimes armed, sometimes not, unsure whether to surrender or hide. American patrols grew accustomed to the sight of German uniforms worn by men and women who looked less like combatants and more like survivors of a catastrophe. And among these scattered, starving groups were individuals whose circumstances would never be fully recorded. Some had been separated from their units for days. Others had collapsed during forced marches between improvised defensive positions. Still others had been abandoned during evacuations deemed too dangerous to include support staff. This is the environment into which our young Luftwaffe auxiliary had been thrust. Her anti-aircraft station, positioned near a strategic crossroads on the northern approach routes, likely received the order to withdraw in late April. But by then, Allied units had already bypassed many positions, isolating them inadvertently. Without vehicles, without food, without clear direction, auxiliaries often attempted to flee through the nearest ruined town. Many never made it. The woman discovered beneath the rubble had almost certainly endured days without proper food. Her uniform, once neatly pressed, was now ragged, coated with soot, and torn at the seams. She carried no weapon. Most auxiliaries were never issued one. Her small pack, if she had one, was gone. Her collapse was not the result of a single moment, but the final step in a long decline of hunger, fear, and exhaustion that had overtaken countless Germans in the war's final weeks. And it was here, in a bombed-out square of a nameless northern town, that her path crossed with the American patrol, a chance intersection created by the immense machinery of war breaking down around ordinary people. For the Americans, this scene was familiar. For her, it was the moment her life narrowed to a single breath. And as we look deeper into how she ended up there, half buried beneath stones, we must understand the structures that produced this chaos, especially the Allied POW system straining under a flood of German surrenders. As Germany collapsed in on itself, the American military found its responsibilities expanding far beyond combat. Every mile gained brought new complications: surrendered troops, liberated laborers, displaced civilians, and abandoned towns. Yet among the most pressing logistical burdens was the sudden explosion of German prisoners of war, hundreds of thousands taken in just weeks. The United States Army had prepared for a steady flow of POWs, but not for a tidal wave. The rapid Allied advance outran its own planning. Rail lines couldn't be repaired in time. Trucks were stretched thin delivering ammunition and fuel. Even rations, carefully calculated for mobile armies, were strained by the unexpected addition of masses of surrendered soldiers. The war was ending, but the responsibility of handling its remnants had only intensified. American doctrine, shaped by the 1929 Geneva Convention, required humane treatment of prisoners. The U.S. military took this obligation seriously. Posts were entitled to food, shelter, medical care, and registration. They were to be protected from violence, intimidation, and public humiliation. But the reality of spring 1945 tested these standards severely. The sheer number of captives forced the Americans to improvise. Many holding areas were nothing more than fenced-off meadows or open fields hastily converted into temporary enclosures. Others were sections of ruined towns secured by patrols. Prisoners sometimes slept in bomb craters, makeshift shelters, or bare ground until proper camps could be organized. For soldiers accustomed to discipline and structure, the sight of thousands of disoriented Germans clustered behind barbed wire created a sense of both urgency and unease. Despite the chaos, American forces maintained order. They conducted rapid triage, wounded prisoners to aid stations, civilians to refugee processing, suspected war criminals to separate interrogation units. But within this controlled system lay a smaller group that American commanders had not planned for: women uniform, female German. Auxiliaries were never numerous on the Western Front, but they existed throughout the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft network and communication branches. Most served behind defensive lines, but by 1945, defensive lines had ceased to exist. Women stationed near strategic crossroads, airfields, or command posts often found themselves directly in the path of advancing American divisions. Many surrendered on the spot. Others were captured inside buildings used as signal stations or flak control centers. To U.S. officers, The presence of women among prisoners created a bureaucratic dilemma. The POW system was built around male captives. Latrine design, sleeping arrangements, medical access, and security protocols all assumed male prisoners. Female auxiliaries had to be held separately or with careful sous. When American troops entered northern Germany, they found not just defeated soldiers, but entire communities on the verge of starvation. The war had broken transportation and agriculture. Livestock had been seized or slaughtered. Many civilians survived on nettles, potato peels, or thin soups stretched from dwindling supplies. German doctors ran out of medicine weeks before Allied forces arrived. Diseases spread unchecked. In some areas, corpses lay unburied for days because there were no coffins, no fuel, and no able-bodied men left to dig graves to the soldiers encountering this. Distinctions between enemy and civilian blurred. They treated the wounded because it was their duty. They respected surrender because it was military law. But when they found people like the Luftwaffe auxiliary, starving, forgotten, and alone, they responded as individuals as much as soldiers. Her discovery, then, was not an isolated miracle, but a reflection of the overwhelming human crisis facing Germany in its final days. She was one of countless lives trembling on the edge, dependent not on strategy or politics, but on the decisions of those who found them. And it is here, within this fragile intersection of war's destruction and humanity's instinct to preserve life, that the deeper angles of this story begin to emerge. Angle 1, the human body under starvation was not sudden in 1945 Germany. It happened gradually, stripping strength layer by layer. By May, many German civilians and auxiliaries lived on rations that barely sustained life: thin barley soup, stale black bread cut with sawdust-like fillers, sometimes nothing at all. The Luftwaffe auxiliary found beneath the rubble had likely endured weeks of this decline. Starvation weakens the body in precise stages. First comes fatigue. Muscles lose their ability to lift, carry, or climb. Then the immune system collapses, leaving even mild infections dangerous. As the body cannibalizes its fat reserves, sharp bones begin to show through the skin. The face hollows. The eyes sink. Thought becomes slow, dreamlike. The mind drifts, not from despair alone, but because the starving brain struggles to process reality. Medical reports from American field hospitals in 1945 described this condition with chilling consistency. Bodies weighing barely 40 kilograms. Heartbeats slowed. Blood pressure dangerously low. Many survivors could not stand without fainting. They trembled continuously, even in warm rooms. And if given too much food too quickly, they risked a fatal collapse known as refeeding shock. The young Luftwaffe woman had not been in a concentration camp, but the body responds to famine in the same way, regardless of cause. Days of walking while retreating from her flat position. Nights without shelter. The acute stress of air raids overhead. The collapse of her unit. The loss of her pack. Eventually, her legs would have given out. She may have crawled toward shelter in the ruined square before losing consciousness completely. To the American soldier who found her, the signs were unmistakable. By May 1945, U.S. troops had seen countless starved bodies, liberated forced laborers, POWs abandoned by their guards, civilians trapped between front lines. He would have known instantly that she was close to death. And that recognition is what pushed him into action. Angle 2. Inside the mind of the American soldier. American infantryman in 1945 was often very young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Many had been civilians only a year earlier, working in factories, farms, or small-town shops. Now they had crossed half of Europe, witnessing destruction on a scale few had imagined possible. Their training taught them discipline, but the war taught them something else: how quickly life could disappear. He had likely lost friends in the months before. He had fought through hedgerows, forests, and river crossings. He had endured German artillery, snipers, counterattacks, and the constant uncertainty of what waited beyond the next ridge. War hardened men, but it also shaped their moral instincts. When confronted with suffering, real, undeniable suffering, many responded with compassion, shaped by exhaustion, rather than hatred. By the time U.S. soldiers reached northern Germany, most had moved beyond ideological hatred of the enemy. They fought to end the war, not to punish individuals. They fought to survive. But when they encountered someone like the Luftwaffe auxiliary, starved, alone, completely helpless, military protocol faded behind human instinct. Yes, she wore the uniform of the enemy. Yes, she served an air defense network that shot at Allied aircraft. But in that moment, lying under rubble, she was no threat, only a human life about to slip away. For a soldier who had seen too much death, saving one life carried weight. It restored something inside him that war had eroded. This is why he knelt beside her instead of walking on. Why he brushed aside the bricks. Why he checked her pulse. Why he called the medic instead of ignoring her as just another casualty of Germany's downfall. He acted because compassion returns most powerfully at the edge of exhaustion. Angle 3, enemy or patient. How war shifts PERCPTIO and military regulations were clear. Enemy personnel must be secured, disarmed, and processed as POWs. But regulations also demanded that wounded or starving individuals, even enemies, receive immediate medical care. And in the final weeks of the war, these two rules collided constantly. American soldiers encountered thousands of people who occupied a gray zone, not clearly enemy combatants, not clearly civilians, not clearly anything. Women auxiliaries were especially ambiguous. Some had assisted flak operations. Others merely relayed messages. Some wore uniforms. Others wore improvised clothing. Some carried identification. Others had lost everything during retreats. For frontline troops, the distinction became simple. If the person was dying, they were treated first. Whether she had fired an anti-aircraft rangefinder or simply relayed commands no longer mattered. Her condition overruled her status. She was not captured in combat. She was found collapsed, half-buried, showing the unmistakable signs of severe starvation. Doctors in field hospitals later described such cases with clinical precision. Dehydration so severe IV fluids had to be administered drop by drop. Blood pressure too low for a pulse to be felt easily. Heartbeats faint and irregular. To them, she was not the enemy. She was a patient in critical distress. The soldier who found her might have started by treating her as a POW, but within seconds, the category shifted. She was no longer a threat to be processed. She was a life to be saved. And this shift, this quiet moment when an enemy becomes a human being before your eyes, forms the emotional core of her rescue. These angles show how physical suffering, soldier psychology, and wartime ethics converged at the moment she was found. Now we turn to deeper human, moral, and historical layers. Angle 4, gender, power, and vulnerability in a collapsing war is overwhelmingly male. But its collapse exposes those whom the system never intended to protect. By 1945, the presence of uniformed women on the German side created a profound vulnerability. Female auxiliaries were trained for technical tasks, radar plotting, signal transmission, range calculation, not survival in frontline chaos. They were not issued weapons. They were not taught escape and evasion. Their roles assumed a functioning command structure, permanent shelters, regular rations, and predictable lines of retreat. But none of that existed in May 1945, once their units dissolved. Women like her were stranded in a landscape where traditional protections disappeared. German soldiers retreating in panic had no capacity to escort them. Civilians, desperate for food, could not take responsibility for strangers. And the proximity of advancing American troops meant that staying hidden was as dangerous as surrendering. In many towns, female auxiliaries tried to discard their uniforms. Some hid insignias under coats. Others removed shoulder boards or buttons. But clothing alone could not hide exhaustion, malnutrition, or the unmistakable air of someone displaced by war. And even if they avoided Soviet troops, whose reputation for vengeance spread like wildfire, they still faced the uncertainty of being captured by Americans who had never been trained to process female POWs. The power imbalance was immense. A starving woman could not negotiate. She could not flee. She had no authority to invoke rights under the Geneva Convention. Her survival depended on the discipline and moral restraint of the soldiers who found her. And despite fears circulating among Germans, American forces maintained strict codes of conduct. Violations were severely punished. Commanders understood the stakes. They represented not only a victorious army, but an emerging occupation government. So when the American soldier knelt beside her, lifting debris from her limp body, the power dynamic was not only military, it was profoundly human. His actions determined the next hour of her life. And in a war filled with atrocities and cruelty, the presence of restraint, of a soldier choosing care over exploitation, stands as one of the overlooked truths of the conflict's final days. Angle 5. The moral weight of small DCIS wars are remembered for major offensives, decisive battles, and the movements of nations. Yet thousands of individual lives pivot on moments that never make the official histories. For the Luftwaffe auxiliary, the moment she collapsed beneath the rubble could have been the quiet, unrecorded last breath of another anonymous casualty, but one soldier noticed her hand move. In vast wars, individual choices often seem insignificant. One soldier, one starving woman, one ruined town, none of it alters grand strategy. It does not shorten the war or shift front lines. It does not change treaties or redraw borders. But it reveals something essential: how humanity survives inside machinery designed for destruction. American troops had been fighting for over a year across France, Belgium, and Germany. They had seen civilians buried under collapsed homes, children digging through rubble for food, and lines of prisoners who could barely stand. These experiences eroded any simplistic view of the enemy. Many understood that most Germans they encountered in the final weeks were surviving day to day, not defending ideology. So when a soldier saw this woman, not resisting, not armed, not defiant, but broken, starved, and barely conscious, the decision to intervene required no orders. It was not strategic. It was instinctive. Compassion became an act of resistance against the dehumanizing nature of war itself. And though this moment will never appear in military dispatches or official reports, it carried immense weight for the two individuals present. For her, it meant survival. For him, it preserved a part of his own humanity. This is why such small acts echo long after the war ends. Angle 6. What history forgets: silence. Memory and the invisible stories of WAR World War II generated millions of documents, battle maps, orders, diaries, interrogation notes, medical reports. Yet the war's most intimate moments rarely survive. Many acts of mercy, kindness, or human connection were never recorded because the people involved moved on, leaving no written trace. Veterans returned home and spoke little of the war. Former POWs, especially women, carried silent memories shaped by shame, trauma, or the desire to rebuild their lives swiftly. Luftwaffe auxiliary rescued by an American soldier would not likely have written about it publicly. Post-war Germany was not a place where women proudly discussed military service under the defeated regime. Many wanted to disappear into civilian life, to avoid association with anything involving the Third Reich. Others feared being questioned about their roles or judged for choices made under coercive conditions. The American soldier, too, may not have spoken of it. The U.S. Army recorded combat actions meticulously, but quiet humanitarian acts performed during patrols rarely reached official paperwork. A soldier saving a starving woman was not newsworthy compared to bridge captures, enemy surrenders, or tactical advances. And after the war, veterans often focused on rebuilding their own futures, taking jobs, returning to school, starting families. Yet these forgotten moments form the moral architecture of the war's ending. They reveal how individuals navigated collapsing systems and overwhelming suffering. They remind us that the final days of the conflict were not solely defined by surrender documents and military maneuvers, but also by desperate human encounters in ruined streets. This is why reconstructing such a story demands attention to every angle: physical, emotional, ethical, and historical. Because from these angles emerges the full weight of the moment that changed her life. And now, with the ground prepared and the human context fully revealed, we turn toward the moment everything converges, the climax, when the soldier makes the decision that will determine whether she lives or dies. The patrol had entered the ruined town cautiously. Though the war was nearly over, no American unit ever assumed safety. German snipers still lingered in church towers. Isolated pockets of fanatics fired from basements or barn lofts. And the closer they marched toward the Elbe River, the more unpredictable the final resistance became. Their boots crunched on broken glass as they moved across the silent square. A toppled cart lay half-burned near the fountain. The Luftwaffe command post that once operated in this town, likely a small signal center, had been evacuated days earlier. American intelligence believed the retreat was chaotic. They expected abandoned equipment, perhaps scattered documents. Maybe a few stragglers dispersed to surrender. They did not expect to find her. One soldier, scanning the corners for movement, noticed a shape slumped beneath collapsed masonry. It might have been nothing. A coat, a tarp, debris shifted by the wind. But as he turned his head, he saw the faintest twitch of a hand. A barely perceptible signal of life. He raised a fist, halting the patrol. The men knelt, rifles angled toward the rubble, expecting the possibility of a wounded soldier feigning injury. They approached slowly. When the lead scout swept aside loose stones, the blue-gray sleeve of a Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform emerged from beneath the dust, but what lay beneath it was far from a threat. She was thin beyond anything they expected, arms no thicker than sticks, wrists protruding sharply. Her face was coated in soot, but the hollowness of her cheeks was visible even under the grime. Her uniform blouse hung loosely as though it belonged to someone twice her size. Her lips were cracked. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible. The medic knelt beside her, placing 2 fingers carefully at her neck. He found a pulse, faint, slow but present. She was unconscious, her body in a state beyond exhaustion. Severe dehydration. Acute starvation. The kind of physical collapse that meant she had been without proper food for days, perhaps weeks. The medic had seen similar cases in liberated camps and among German POWs abandoned during retreats. He signaled quietly, "She's alive." The soldier who first saw her leaned in closer. She could not speak. Her eyelids fluttered weakly when he brushed away dust. She made an attempt to shift her head, but the effort drained what little strength remained. When he lifted her lightly to check for wounds, she weighed almost nothing. This was not a combatant. This was someone who had been left behind. Someone who had been walking until her body could no longer carry her. A casualty of hunger, collapse, and a system that had disintegrated around her. But the patrol still faced a decision. Their orders were strict. Clear the town. Check for remaining resistance. Move to the next objective. The division was pushing fast toward the river. Every delay created risk. Carrying an unconscious POW across ruined streets complicated their advance. The squad leader considered this. Then he looked at her again. Her identification disc was missing. Her insignia partly torn off, likely by the rubble. She had no weapon. Her hands were raw, scraped from trying to crawl or pull herself from debris. She was a Luftwaffe auxiliary, not frontline infantry, one of the women assigned to anti-aircraft operations or signal relays, unarmed, non-combatant, young. He made the decision without hesitation. She would not be left behind. The medic carefully lifted her, supporting her head to prevent shock. 2 soldiers stepped forward to help. They debated whether she should walk, but it was clear she could not stand. They found a stable piece of wood from the debris, using it as a makeshift stretcher. As they carried her, her arm slipped slightly, revealing the nearly skeletal structure beneath her sleeve. The patrol moved quickly now, scanning windows and alleys. But their focus was split. They were responsible not only for securing the area, but also for keeping her alive long enough to reach medical care. It was a strange feeling in those final days of the war. The same men who had fought through countless German defenses were now carrying a German woman. Carefully, as though she were a wounded ally, they reached the edge of town where their vehicles waited. The medic gave her small sips of water, watching carefully for signs of shock. Her throat moved weakly as she swallowed. Her eyes flickered open, confused, unfocused. She looked at the faces around her, but seemed unable to understand where she was or who held her. For a moment, she clutched weakly at the soldier's sleeve, a reflex rather than intent. Her fingers barely closed. The strength simply wasn't there. He steadied her hand gently, ensuring it didn't slip. They loaded her onto a transport jeep, wrapping her in a blanket to protect her from the cold wind sweeping across the plains. As the engine rumbled to life, she lay motionless, but alive. The soldier who found her climbed onto the sideboard, keeping watch as the vehicle pulled away from the ruined square. They were taking her to the nearest American aid station, the first place she had been safe in months, and what awaited her there. would shape the next critical hours of her survival. The aid station stood inside a repurposed brick schoolhouse on the outskirts of the town, one of the few structures still standing with its roof intact. The windows were shattered, but the walls held steady. Outside, a Red Cross flag fluttered from a broken flagpole, marking the place where triage, treatment, and registration converged. In the chaotic final days of the war, American medics had transformed the classrooms into makeshift wards. Desks were pushed aside to make space for cots. Shelves once filled with children's books now held bandages, medical kits, morphine vials, and salvaged blankets. The hallways smelled of antiseptic mixed with smoke drifting in from the devastated countryside. When the jeep arrived, 2 medics rushed out, expecting another wounded soldier or an injured POW. Instead, they found a young German woman barely conscious, wrapped in an American blanket, her uniform hanging loosely from her skeletal frame. They exchanged a glance, not of surprise, but recognition. They had seen this condition before. She was carried gently inside and placed on a cot near the wall, beneath a cracked chalkboard still faintly marked with pre-war lessons. A medic checked her pulse again. Weak, but still present. Her skin was cool to the touch. Her breathing shallow. Signs of severe caloric depletion, the kind that required immediate but careful intervention. They began by warming her hands and feet, then offering water in controlled amounts. Rapid hydration could kill a starved body. Everything had to be done slowly. A nurse's aide cut away the dirt-caked edge of her sleeve to clean abrasions on her arm. Another medic checked her for shrapnel wounds or fractures. None were found. It was hunger and exhaustion that had nearly taken her life, not direct violence. She had collapsed because her body could no longer sustain itself. A doctor arrived to assess her. He had spent weeks treating liberated prisoners and malnourished civilians, and the signs were unmistakable. Sunken eyes, brittle hair, tachycardia, visible ribs, faint muscular tremors. She had likely been walking for days after her unit broke apart. The collapse of German transport systems meant auxiliaries often moved on foot from one failed position to another, eating whatever they could find along the way, often nothing at all. Now, she lay still on the cot, barely responsive. But alive, the American soldier who found her remained nearby. Regulations did not require his presence. Once she was handed over, she became a patient under medical authority. But something held him there, perhaps the memory of how fragile she had looked beneath the rubble, or the knowledge that had he arrived minutes later, she might not have survived. He watched as the doctor issued instructions: small doses of glucose solution, gradual introduction of weak broth, careful monitoring of her pulse. Too much food too quickly could trigger cardiac arrest. The staff moved efficiently, their experience evident in their steady hands and calm expressions. Hours passed. She drifted between consciousness and sleep, her mind slow to process the unfamiliar voices and surroundings. At one point, she stirred, her eyes opening slightly. The room came into focus only in fragments, the outlines of uniforms, the soft light filtering through cracked glass, the sound of boots in the hallway. She tried to speak but produced only a rasp, her throat too dry to form words. A medic lifted her gently, helping her sip a measured spoonful of broth. Her hands trembled with the effort. The warmth of the liquid seemed almost foreign to her body. But she swallowed. And then another small spoonful. And another dot with each intake. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. Administrative officers soon arrived to document her presence. They needed to know, was she a POW? A civilian? A non-combatant auxiliary? But her weak state made detailed questioning impossible. So they recorded what they could: gender, approximate age, Luftwaffe uniform, no visible weapons, severe malnutrition. Her full identification would wait until she recovered enough strength to speak clearly. The administrative uncertainty didn't delay her care. Under American rules, patience came first. Paperwork came later. In the late afternoon, the soldier stepped outside the schoolhouse for a moment. The war felt strangely distant here. Birds had begun to return to the edges of the ruined town. Distant artillery was now rare, drowned out instead by the murmurs of displaced civilians gathering near roads in search of food or safety. Victory in Europe was days away, yet the weight of human suffering remained heavy in the air. When he returned to her bedside, she was asleep, not the shallow, involuntary unconsciousness from earlier, but real, restorative sleep. Her breathing had steadied. Her hands no longer trembled uncontrollably. The blanket rose and fell with each breath. For the first time in weeks, her body had a chance to begin repairing itself. The doctor approached the soldier, offering a brief nod. She was no longer on the brink. She would survive the night. With continued care, she might survive the week. And after that, after nourishment began rebuilding what starvation had consumed, her future would fall into the hands of the post-war process that awaited all Germans, especially those captured in uniform. For now, though, she slept in safety, under the protection of the very army she had once served against. And as the sun set behind the shattered rooftops of the town, the soldier took a slow breath, knowing that the hardest battle of her life, the one against hunger and collapse, had finally shifted in her favor. But survival was only the beginning. What came after this moment would define the rest of her journey through a defeated nation. The war in Europe ended just days after she arrived at the aid station. On May 8, 1945, German forces signed unconditional surrender. Guns fell silent across the continent. Yet for millions of people scattered across ruined towns, shattered roads, and overflowing camps, the chaos did not suddenly resolve. Peace did not mean order. It meant transition, a slow, often painful movement from collapse toward the uncertain structure of occupation. For the Luftwaffe auxiliary, the first stage of that transition began inside the converted schoolhouse. Over the next days, her condition stabilized under careful supervision. She was fed in measured amounts, rested for hours at a time, and slowly regained enough strength to sit upright. Her heartbeat strengthened. The tremors in her hands faded. When her eyes opened fully for the first time, she could finally register her surroundings, the rows of cots, the American medics, the distant echo of boots in the hallway, the strange hum of English voices around her. Her first attempts to speak were faint, shaped by exhaustion and dehydration. She offered fragments of her name, her unit designation, her last known location. The staff recorded these details to determine her proper status under American custody. She was classified as a non-combatant military auxiliary, a distinction that placed her somewhere between formal POW and civilian internee. It meant she would not be mixed into the large male prisoner compounds. It also meant she would remain under American authority until investigations, health evaluations, and repatriation logistics were completed. Outside her small world of blankets and medical equipment, the Allied systems were shifting rapidly. With the fall of Germany, the United States Army assumed responsibility for millions of people. Former soldiers lined up at collection points. Civilians approached American checkpoints seeking food and safety. Displaced persons, forced laborers from across Europe, surged through towns in search of transport home. Captured Nazi officials were brought under guard for interrogation. And woven among these streams were small groups of female auxiliaries, often confused, malnourished, and unsure of what the post-war years would demand of them. Once the Luftwaffe woman regained the strength to stand and walk short distances, she was transferred from the aid station to a receiving facility on the edge of a larger town secured by American forces. It was not a prison camp in the traditional sense, more a controlled compound where individuals in her category could be processed safely. There, she underwent medical examinations, answered questions about her service, and received basic clothing to replace the tattered uniform that no longer fit her. The American soldier, who had found her, visited once more before his unit moved on. The meeting was brief, shaped by the unspoken understanding that they would soon take separate paths. He stood by the gate while she, supported by a nurse, approached slowly. She looked stronger now, still thin, still pale, but no longer fading toward death. They exchanged a quiet acknowledgement, no grand gestures, no words needed. She understood that without his intervention, she would not have lived long enough to stand there. After that, their lives diverged as the machinery of occupation and demobilization carried them in opposite directions. His division moved deeper into northern Germany, tasked with securing transportation routes, overseeing surrenders, and establishing stability in newly controlled areas. Within months, orders would arrive for rotations home or reassignment into occupation duty. Some soldiers returned to the United States under the GI Bill to begin new lives. Others remained in Europe as part of the massive effort to rebuild a defeated nation. Her path was different. As a non-combatant auxiliary, She was not held long-term like male POWs assigned to labor detachments. Her main barrier to release was her physical condition, and the difficulty of determining where, in a ruined nation, she could safely return. Many towns no longer existed as functioning communities. Families had been displaced. Roads were unreliable. And the occupation authorities were cautious about releasing anyone without ensuring they could reach a stable destination. But slowly, step by step, she gained strength. The recovery was painfully slow. Starvation leaves lasting consequences, yet she pushed through each stage with the determination of someone who had already survived the hardest part. Her rescue had been a single moment, but its effects would shape every moment that followed. And as the war shifted fully into occupation, repatriation, and reconstruction, the long-term consequences of her survival, and the survival of millions like her, began to unfold across the ruins of post-war Germany. In the months after Germany's surrender, the country entered a period historians would later call the Hunger Years. Cities stood in ruins. Farmland was scarred by bombs and tank tracks. Railway lines were twisted heaps of steel. Food production collapsed. The average German caloric intake fell far below subsistence levels. Even those who survived the final months of fighting now faced a slow, grinding struggle simply to stay alive. For the Luftwaffe auxiliary who had been pulled from the rubble, recovery unfolded within this harsh landscape. Once she was deemed medically stable, she was transferred to a women's holding facility operated jointly by American and local authorities. Here, former auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and other non-combatant personnel gathered in groups of quiet women, each carrying her own mixture of trauma, guilt, confusion, and relief. Daily life in the facility was structured. Basic meals, medical checkups, registration interviews, and instruction on what the occupation government required next. Many women waited anxiously for news of their families. Some had lost entire households to air raids. Others found their hometowns swallowed by new borders drawn between East and West. Every letter that arrived carried the weight of fate. Her progress was steady, but slow. Extreme starvation leaves damage that cannot be undone quickly. She struggled with dizziness for weeks. Her heart needed time to rebuild strength. Her body consumed every calorie as though fearing it might vanish again. But each month brought greater stability. She learned to walk without support. Her voice returned. Her face filled out. She regained the ability to eat normal meals without risk of collapse. Eventually, the Americans arranged for her transfer back toward her home region, or what remained of it. The journey took her through landscapes that mirrored her own recovery. Devastated towns where children scavenged bricks. Train platforms crowded with displaced persons. Roads where columns of returning soldiers walked beside families carrying all they owned in a single cart. When she finally stepped onto the soil of her hometown, she found a place transformed. Buildings that once lined the market square had been reduced to skeletal frames. Her neighbors were fewer. Those who remained carried the same hollow-eyed look she had worn in the aid station only weeks earlier. They greeted her not with celebration, but with the quiet recognition that survival itself was now an achievement. For her, rebuilding life meant starting almost from nothing. Former auxiliaries were rarely prosecuted unless they had directly participated in criminal acts, and her role in Luftwaffe communications placed her far from such accusations. Still, she faced the same burden as millions of Germans, the task of reconstructing identity in the aftermath of defeat. The uniform she once wore had vanished. The beliefs she had been taught to trust were shattered. The world she understood had died in the rubble, from which she was pulled, and yet she lived. Small acts of kindness, a neighbor sharing bread, a local doctor providing medicine, American relief workers distributing powdered milk, helped anchor her return to ordinary life. She never returned to military work. Instead, like many women of her generation, she turned toward rebuilding homes, supporting family members, and stitching together a sense of normalcy within the ruins. She aged quietly, carrying memories she rarely spoke aloud. Far away, the American soldier who had found her stepped into his own post-war world. He returned to a nation celebrating victory, to crowded train stations filled with families welcoming soldiers home. Under the GI Bill, he may have pursued education or work, or begun a family of his own. And although he spoke of the war only sparingly, as many veterans did, he carried certain memories with clarity. Among them, the image of a starving woman half buried beneath rubble, and the knowledge that one small moment of attention had pulled her across the line between life and death. Their paths never crossed again, yet their brief intersection, a single hour in a ruined German town, echoed across decades. It represented something powerful in the long shadow of war, a reminder that amid the enormity of destruction, the choices of individuals still mattered. And as Germany rebuilt itself into a divided nation, and later into a cornerstone of Europe, her continued life became part of a silent thread connecting past and present, a testament to the fragile, stubborn endurance of humanity, even in history's darkest hours. In the long record of World War II, the vast machinery of conflict often overshadows the small, fragile moments that reveal the human core of the struggle. Historians map divisions, count casualties, and chart offensives across continents. But the true shape of war is also defined by scenes like the one in that ruined German square, quiet, easily overlooked, marked not by explosions or orders, but by a single human decision. The Luftwaffe auxiliary carried no weapon when she was found. She posed no threat, commanded no influence, and represented no strategic value. She was, in military terms, insignificant. Yet in that moment of collapse, she embodied something far larger, the millions of ordinary people trapped inside a war they did not control, swept along by forces far beyond their choosing. And the American soldier who lifted her from the rubble did so not because he was instructed to, but because he recognized a universal truth, that suffering is not diminished by the uniform someone wears. He acted according to the quiet principles that survive even when nations fall apart: mercy toward the weak, responsibility toward the helpless, dignity toward a life on the edge. Their encounter did not change the course of the war. It did not alter the borders drawn in the months ahead. It did not enter official history books or military dispatches. Yet it matters precisely because it reveals what war cannot fully destroy. Even in the final days of a brutal conflict, humanity persisted, not in speeches or treaties, but in the small, unrecorded decisions made by individuals who refused to surrender their compassion. Today, the ruined town has long since been rebuilt. The broken square is paved. Children walk where the rubble once lay. Time has erased the physical traces of that moment, but its meaning remains, quietly embedded in the story of two lives that briefly intersected, one collapsing, one reaching down, and between them, a choice that preserved a life when almost everything else had been lost. If this story moved you, consider supporting our work by subscribing. There are many more forgotten moments of history waiting to be told.